welcome again for another talk in our series. Thanks very much for making it. Welcome to everybody from around the world. Especially welcome to Anastasia, who has generously agreed to give a talk about her relatively recent work since she was at Berkeley as a postdoc, but also her independent work as a professor at UCSD. She's been at UCSD for, Anastasia, has it been about a year and a half?
No, I just started in January.
Wow, okay.
So not very long.
So Anastasia is the COVID professor of cognitive neuroscience at UCSD, presumably working remotely. Before that, she was a postdoc with Desposito at Berkeley. So she's familiar to many of you, and she's collaborated with us before as well. So we know her quite well. And then before that, she was a grad student. You finished her PhD at Duke, right? With Tobias?
Yeah, Tobias Egner.
And then before that, I think you were at UPenn, is that right?
Yes, I was a lab manager, research assistant, working with Amishi Jha, doing work on the influence of meditation and other forms of training on working memory and attention. But I've since moved in a more and more basic science direction.
I see. Good practice for virus isolation.
Yeah.
So she's moved across the country from the rough side to the good side, and it's great to have you back virtually in Berkeley. Thank you very much for agreeing to give a talk, and welcome.
Thanks. Thank you so very much for having me. It's good to interact with people in whatever way that I can. Since I've only been at UCSD for, this past half a year, really most of what I'm going to talk about is the sort of, history of my research arc. And then towards the end, if there's time, I'd want to talk about some of my ongoing projects. I'm not sure how long you all usually take here. In the Desposito lab, we had 3-hour lab meetings, but I don't expect that to be the case everywhere. So I'm going to give sort of a broad and sometimes high-level overview, not really talking so much about the kind of things I was collaborating with Dave on, but hopefully it'll be interesting to many of you. So let me go ahead and share. Okay, you have my my screen there? Okay. Oh wait, hold on. I wanted to get a little clicker going. Okay. So as humans, we have this remarkable ability to guide our behavior based on goal information that's internally generated and maintained. And I mean that as in contrast to information that's only available out in the environment. So this short-term goal maintenance ability, it's typically called working memory. And I'm going to use that term working memory here, but I don't want it to limit you to some existing idea you might have about what working memory means. Because the way it's often studied in the lab is basically the equivalent of this, having participants remember simple stimuli in a vacuum. And of course, that's critical fundamental work, but I call working memory remarkable because in reality, we fundamentally find ourselves going about our lives just trying to achieve our goals, big and small, constantly relying on this ability to do so, while we also face a continuous stream of interference from competing perceptual input and other more immediate demands for our attention in the environment. So the overarching question of my research program has been, how do we do this? So this process for keeping information in mind, it's called working memory maintenance. And the process can take a few forms. It's sometimes a verbal rehearsal or sometimes a visual refreshing process. Because we use this basic maintenance ability to hold information in several sensory modalities and also at several levels, including abstract goals that shape an entire episode or context-specific task rules, as well as concrete sensory information that contributes to meeting those rules, and also representations of the recent sensory past that help to bridge moments of perceptual experience. And the short-term goal maintenance, it also feeds into and reciprocally interacts with a bunch of other processes like learning, decision-making, and many others. And I'm going to focus on these three today. So I want to promote appreciation of working memory, not just as this isolated storage capacity, even though it does happen to relate positively to a bunch of other indices of success, but as a ubiquitous contributor to all of the other processes that we care about. But this ubiquity can also have unwanted consequences. So for instance, our goal information can become degraded or displaced by incoming perceptual input or concurrent demands. Then on the flip side, our maintained content can sometimes bleed over into other tasks, driving our attention in the environment. So, for instance, we found across many studies that visual attention can be captured by stimuli in the environment that match the features of what's being maintained in working memory. And that's even at the expense of attending to perceptual stimuli that are more immediately relevant. And we might expect this sort of behavior to arise if working memory content shared the same representations with perceptual processing. So in other words, if the neural responses that reflect the stimulus properties of what's being maintained internally with working memory overlap with the neural responses for perception, it could promote interactions between those representations. So for the purposes of this talk, when we see this sort of detrimental influence between working memory and environmental demands, I'm going to call that evidence of competition. But I'm going to argue that these seeming flaws don't necessarily reflect some severe shortcoming in our cognitive capacity, but instead that they emerge from the efficient structure of a generally adaptive system. And on top of that, that we can harness these vulnerabilities as a window into the structure and function of the system by examining when they do, and importantly, when they don't occur. Because actually, these kinds of flaws are relatively rare. We notice our failures more, and working memory gets a ton of flack for being severely capacity limited. But for the most part, we remember our short-term goals impressively well. And we'd be pretty debilitated if we couldn't. And I can say from personal experience that I've tried many, many different ways of distracting participants during working memory maintenance, and they're annoyingly good at remembering everything despite my best efforts. So in other words, we likely engage some forms of control to reduce competition and to promote successful behavior. So when the influence of competition is minimized, I'm going to call that evidence of control. And we think that the functions that accomplish this control in working memory may be similar to the way that attention is controlled in the environment. So for example, we've shown that well-established properties of strategic attentional orienting are recapitulated in working memory. And I'm going to talk about these things today. And along with Dave, we've made the case that the same sorts of sequential or trial history effects that modulate perception and attention occur in working memory as well. So this suggests that working memory may rely on the same domain general attentional functions as perception. And together, these findings culminate in the theoretical perspective that working memory maintenance is an attentional function of endogenously activating the same content representations that are activated by perceptual processing. It's a theory that's typically referred to as sensory or sensory motor recruitment. So what do we actually know at this point about how the brain might achieve this sensory recruitment? Right now, the field is engaged in a lively debate about how and where working memory information is stored in the brain. And what we really know boils down to just a few reliable findings. Working memory maintenance is associated with elevated activity in lateral frontal and parietal brain regions. And this is sometimes referred to as delay activity. And also information about the features of what's being maintained can also be detected in distributed patterns of sensory activity, reflecting a population response. And that's even when the average activity of the region is unchanged. So we know that both of these types of activations can fluctuate with several different kinds of task demand. But what we still don't know is the true functional role that the activations play, or how those roles might be affected when working memory is challenged in different ways. So according to this sensory recruitment perspective, this sort of frontoparietal delay activity that we typically see, it actually reflects attentional signals. And those signals bias activity in the sensory and other regions where the content-specific feature information, the item information is held. But this perspective, it provokes, several looming questions. So for one, if working memory content is actually stored in sensory cortex, then how does it withstand all the incoming perceptual input? And if it depends on attention, how does working memory survive when attention is directed elsewhere? So we have to answer these questions to understand how working memory operates, but they also provide a route for testing the expectations of the sensory recruitment theory. The theory which predicts that working memory and perception should compete for both cortical territory and attentional processing. So the studies that I'm going to show you today, they use competition as a tool to test these sensory recruitment hypotheses. So rather than just study this, my approach is to challenge working memory in order to understand it. So specifically, I'm going to ask whether working memory content and perceptual content interact like they should if they share cortical territory, and whether working memory maintenance is influenced by perceptual processing demands like it should be if they share attentional functions. And then in what I think is a really important sort of new direction for this field, I'm going to assess the implications of this sort of competition for our actions in the environment. And then at each step of the way, I'm going to ask how the interactions or competition between our internal maintenance processes and externally oriented behaviors can be controlled. And all the studies I'm going to show you today make use of a similar basic cognitive task structure. So I just want to introduce you to that approach as sort of an organizing principle across the otherwise distinct manipulations that I'm going to describe. So as a general rule, we combine demands across domains of cognition. So we'll typically have participants remember one or multiple items over a delay of several seconds. And then while they're maintaining that information, have them perform some kind of intervening perceptual, attentional, or action task before then being tested on their memory of that initial information. So the idea is to use behavioral perturbation that can both manipulate the brain activity associated with maintenance and also read out the properties of the maintained information. And conversely, to use memory performance to gauge the influence of those intervening demands.
There is one question in the chat. It says, how do you operationally define competition? As feature competition?
Yeah, so I have sort of simplified some of the complexities that go into the idea of competition for the sake of this talk. I'm operationally defining it as basically when we witness the interactions between domains. So that could be, between features or content or between demands. So basically I'm taking the observation of some sort of impact between them as evidence that there is competition. And that is an oversimplification because sometimes the interaction can be helpful and sometimes it can be harmful. But here I'm basically just talking about the interaction occurring, if that makes sense. Sometimes it is at the feature level. Okay, so these first two experiments use a behavioral probe to test the prediction that internally maintained goal content should influence performance as if it's being perceived. So this first study is a very simple one where we first asked whether holding a word in working memory rather than perceiving and reading it can produce conflict in a simple perceptual judgment akin to the classic Stroop effect. So in a standard color word Stroop, the task is to identify the ink color of a word whose meaning could be either congruent or incongruent with the color of the ink. And color naming is slower when the two are incongruent and faster when they are congruent. So here, we just separated out the word meaning and color naming components by having people first encode a word, either red, blue, green, or yellow, that they'd be tested on several seconds later. And then during the delay, while they still had to hold on to the meaning of that initial word, they pressed a button to indicate the color of a patch on the screen. And then after a few seconds, they were tested on their memory of that initial word. Like in the classic Stroop, on individual trials, the word meaning and the color judgment could be incongruent or congruent with each other. And we administered both a standard Stroop and this modified working memory Stroop in the same participants. So if working memory content influences behavior as if it's being perceived, then maintaining an incongruent word in working memory, it should produce conflict in color naming, much like the standard Stroop effect. So first, I'm just going to show you response times on the classic Stroop for both congruent and incongruent trials. And as expected, there's a robust Stroop congruency effect whereby color naming is slower on incongruent trials. When we look at our working memory task, we see not just a similar pattern, but a dramatic congruency effect of the same magnitude as the classic Stroop. All right, so, depending on your perspective, this may seem really obvious or really intuitive, but, I just want you to think about the implications of the fact that in the working memory task, the word is in their minds. It's not visible in the environment, but that working memory content is influencing behavior on this simple task as powerfully as if it were being activated by current perceptual input. So this shows us that our internally maintained content, it can sometimes unintentionally interact with our immediate demands, presumably because working memory and perceptual processing share the same cortical real estate. Or in other words, that maintaining the word read activates the same or similar neural response patterns to actually seeing it. If that were true, then we'd also expect the degree of competition between internal and perceptual content to depend on their degree of similarities. Is there a distinction between perceiving the memorized color and the memory store for that color? Do you mean, well, I'm not sure. Do you mean is when you perceive a color versus maintain a color, are those distinct regions in the brain?
Or you're muted.
Your mute's on. You're muted.
Oh.
Christina, can you unmute him?
Yes, let me get right on that. we go.
I was wondering, is there a difference between a process of saying the word to yourself and actually having an internal image? In other words, is it a memory or a process, or does that make any sense? I'm not convinced.
Well, so I will say that, right, here, like in the standard Stroop, the, it's a verbal, it's a reading process and a verbal maintenance. And obviously the, perceptual judgment is for the actual color. So, there are distinct stores for, verbally rehearsing red and seeing red, but either one tends to activate the other. I'm not sure if I'm getting at your question about the.
Okay, I'm sorry, I
I mean,
apologize. Please.
so no, it's fine. I mean, I guess my perspective is essentially that that there's both a process and a store, and I'm hopefully going to touch on different levels of competition in both, but that that the process of perceiving and the process of maintaining may be distinct, but they both activate a similar store.
Thank you.
Okay, so right, so if this were true, we would expect the degree of competition between internal and perceptual content depend on their similarity or their degree of cortical overlap. So for instance, stimuli from different content categories should be segregated in cortex, so should interfere with each other relatively little, whereas more similar stimuli should compete more for neural representation. And in that competition, it should impact the quality of the neural representations, and that should be evident in behavior. But we also know that this sort of competition can be minimized by focusing attention on a given stimulus or location, which suppresses processing for nearby stimuli that would otherwise compete, or what's been called center surround inhibition, where the stimuli at the center of attention are prioritized and enhanced, and that comes at the expense of immediately surrounding stimuli, which are suppressed, while more distant stimuli are unaffected. So in other words, we would expect only the most competitive stimuli to be suppressed. So in visuospatial attention, it might manifest as something like this to sharpen processing at the attended location. So in this next study, we asked whether the interactions between working memory and perceptual stimuli follow a similar center surround pattern, which they should if their representations are in fact competing in sensory cortex. So to test this, we took advantage of a now well-established observation that I mentioned earlier, namely that the features of what's being maintained in working memory can inadvertently guide attention to perceptual stimuli that have matching features. So this can be measured using a task manipulation like the one you see here, where participants are asked to remember a simple color stimulus and then perform an intervening visual search, in this case for a slanted line among straight line distractors. But the catch is that the visual search target is embedded within a shape that could be a match or a non-match to the working memory sample. So, and this is a very reliable finding that visual search is faster when the target coincides with the stimulus that matches what's being held in working memory, but slower when a working memory match surrounds a search distractor. So here we developed a really simple variation on this manipulation where there are only two visual search stimuli, and then those coincide with color stimuli that are always directly opposite each other on the color wheel. But the critical manipulation in this version of the task is that the similarity between the working memory sample and the search target varied continuously. So for instance, the search target could coincide with an exact match to the working memory sample, in which case the search distractor would be the opposite color on the color wheel. And then the search stimuli span the entire color range, up to and including trials where the search distractor was an exact match to the working memory sample. So without considering the hypothetical suppressive effect, we would at least expect the visual search to be fastest when the search target coincides with an exact working memory match. And then we'd expect that the magnitude of that benefit would continuously diminish as the working memory and visual search targets became less and less similar, which would look like this. But if surround inhibition in working memory does in fact suppress processing of the most similar and therefore the most competitive perceptual input, then we should see a visual search RT pattern that looks like this, just for the visual stimuli that are immediately neighboring the working memory sample in feature space. So the idea here is to use visual search performance to gauge the properties of working memory maintenance, where content that's activated in working memory, it should capture visual attention in the search, but perceptual stimuli that are most competitive with the working memory content should be suppressed, and so that capture should be diminished. And in fact, when we look at visual search response times, here as a function of the color distance between the working memory sample and the search target, we see, as we'd expect, that the search is fastest when the target matches the working memory sample, and slowest when the working memory sample matches the search distractor. But when we zoom in on just the range of search target colors that are most similar, and therefore the most potentially confusable or competitive with the working memory sample, we see this stereotypical center surround pattern. So search performance is speeded when the target exactly matches the working memory sample, like we've seen many times before. But that benefit is eliminated for search target colors that are the most nearby to the working memory sample in color space and fall within that presumed inhibitory surround. Then the benefit returns for stimuli that are outside the inhibitory surround and would compete less. And then the benefit continuously diminishes as the search target gets less and less similar to the working memory content. So it does look like visual processing is suppressed for stimuli that would compete the most with working memory maintenance. And I just want to point out, the incredibly subtle perceptual distinction between the working memory sample and the colors that were effectively inhibited, to the point that you might not even consciously notice that they're different colors. But the system does, and it inhibits only those stimuli that would theoretically pose the greatest competitive threat to working memory maintenance.
All right, I have a question.
Sure.
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
So I just noticed one thing which is very interesting is that this biases or this inhibition seems asymmetrical, like around the wheels. So you can see that the graph you're showing here on the left, the peak is around like -20, and around on the right, the peak is around like 10 degrees, I guess, the difference in color. So I was wondering, did you like have any potential explanation to that? And also, did you like take a look at individual subject to see whether this center surround like inhibition varies from person to person? Do they have all share this asymmetry or not?
I didn't. So I have noticed that, and then didn't really. So what I will say that we did examine sort of individual variability in the center surround, but what we quantified was sort of the magnitude of it. So sort of the amount of the difference between the fastest performance and when it was inhibited. And we found that that correlated with working memory behavior. But we didn't, we didn't really have enough participants even to make that clear. It was done in more of a psychophysics style where we did a bunch of sessions with only 12 people. And actually for this paper ended up collapsing across these two directions. I show it this way because I think it's more compelling to see that that it does recapitulate this full pattern. But then, just for the sake of having more trials in each case, and we did some, also did some computational modeling on this, ended up collapsing. But, so, yeah, I don't know. I'd be hesitant to make any, there's probably some expectation about biases in one direction or another that might explain the asymmetry. But I will say there was definitely, variability. I think, 9 or 10 out of our 12 participants all showed the pattern, but where it peaked was, was variable. It wasn't massively variable. It peaked between 10 and 30 degrees.
I see.
But it would be interesting to, to quantify whether the width of the surround also also related to behavior. But I don't have anything that interesting to say about the asymmetry because I didn't examine it in any.
No, it's already interesting enough. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my comment about that. I just wonder how much is related to because there is no. You divided the color wheel every 10 degrees, but the difference doesn't seem to be similar. I mean, it's easier to distinguish the orange in the orange direction compared to the purple or the violet. So because it's, I mean, the color is actually not really linear in a way. So I don't know how much my count is.
No, and that's totally true. The bias, this again, something that is in the data, but it was not formally analyzed. The extent and magnitude of the surround inhibition, it's not equal across all colors, and all of the colors in this space are not equally perceptually discriminable. I mean, this is showing, these are just example colors and their spacing. This includes every matchup of the different color combinations. So it's not just about the difference between violets and oranges, but there are definitely asymmetrical sort of manifestations of the suppression at color category boundaries and things like that.
Yeah, thanks.
You have psychometric functions for measuring the colors in the two directions. It might be right there. If you just look at the psychometric at the steepness of the psychometric function on the right side and the left side, variation in color might come out that just maybe physically or perceptually different on the right and left side and the purple side and the orange side. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. If you had measured sensitivity to color as you went out from red to yellow, and you measure sensitivity as you go out from red to purple, those may not have exactly the same shape psychometrics. One may change faster than the other, and that would give you this angle difference. Because the angle just possibly just a measure of how sensitive they are to differences in the color. Does that make any sense?
It does. But
you find out, you just measure, probably it's in the color literature. You can just look at, see what the sensitivity is as you go toward the yellow end and as you go toward the blue end.
Yeah, sorry, I'm thinking through whether that would capture it all. But yeah, I think a lot of these we can just address with the data that we have. All right, am I moving on? Okay, so just to summarize that first section, oh geez, you're gonna have to tell me, I have quite a bit more to get through, and I took out a study, so I don't know, you know, I'll need some cues about, you know, how long I should take here and what I should skip. But anyway, summarize this first section. Across 2 experiments, we saw that our internally maintained content can have unintended consequences for ongoing processing. It can conflict with a very simple perceptual judgment, and interactions between our maintained and perceived content depend on the similarity between them, like we would expect if those interactions arose from overlap in cortical representations. But when the maintained and perceived content compete, processing of the most potentially confusable input seems to be suppressed, presumably to protect the working memory content. So I think these first 2 experiments, they give us a flavor for how intervening perceptual and cognitive demands can be embedded along with working memory maintenance to probe the storage properties of what's being maintained. And I'd argue that these instances of what I call competition here, which are magnified between stimuli that are the most similar, they actually provide evidence for an efficient representational system where the same cortical real estate can be multi-purposed for a variety of processes. But as I described at the outset, the sensory recruitment framework also predicts that maintenance is an attentional process to endogenously activate those representations. So there should be competition at the level of the process and the representation, in which case working memory should suffer when attention is detracted away. So this next experiment manipulates the difficulty or time consumption of a visual attention task that's completed during working memory maintenance, with the expectation that this should consequently influence the quality of the maintained representations. So here we tested this using, sorry, I'm realizing now that Bill, you were trying to make a suggestion. I didn't mean, I wasn't meaning to blow you off. I was just commenting on my own timing.
No issue. No worries.
Yeah, sorry, I totally missed what was happening there. But we can revisit it at the at the end maybe. Okay, so we're using fMRI neuroimaging here to gauge the discriminability of the activation patterns that are associated with the working memory content. So specifically, while we measured brain activity with fMRI, participants completed a task where they remembered an item over a delay of several seconds. Then during the delay, they completed a series of visual search trials where the task was to report the orientation of the one and only vertical item in the array. And then they were tested on their memory of that initial sample. But on individual trials, the memory sample could be either a face or a house, and the visual search distractors could be either more or less discriminable from the target. So we'd expect on trials when the search targets and distractors are harder to tell apart, that this task might occupy attention for longer periods of time and then might therefore cause the working memory representations to deteriorate. We tested this idea by training classifiers on the patterns of responses associated with face and house stimuli using fMRI data from the cortical regions that preferentially respond to those stimulus classes. And then during working memory maintenance, while participants performed this other task, we tested whether those classifiers could tell whether the maintained stimulus was a face or a house. So for this study, the discriminability of the multivariate sensory patterns, or accuracy for classifying the working memory stimulus as a face or a house, it's serving as our proxy for the strength of the maintained representations. So here I'm going to plot classifier accuracy, and I'm going to do that separately for the two visual search difficulty conditions at each time point across the trial. And we see first that decoding is highly accurate, when the stimulus is being displayed, like we would expect, when you're actually perceiving the working memory sample. And then it drops off during the delay. But critically, while the classification stays above chance in the easier search condition, which is plotted here in gray, it drops to chance in the harder condition, which is plotted here in orange. So this suggests that the sensory working memory representations can be somewhat eroded by concurrent attentional demands, even when the perceptual input is matched. Or at least that these particular signals are conveying less diagnostic information about what's being remembered. So therefore, we think that working memory does compete for attentional processing. And this is great because it supports my expectations, but what I neglected to show you is that working memory behavior, participants' ability to remember the initial stimulus at the end of this trial, it was essentially fine, despite this barrage of visual demand. So, this has made me question the assumptions of the sensory recruitment theory, and especially question the functional role that these sensory activation patterns play if working memory performance can survive when what we presume to be the representation becomes undetectable. And I point this out just because it's, I think, a really big missing link in our understanding right now. I haven't personally resolved it. I think there are a few different things that could be going on to explain the seeming discrepancy between neural activation patterns and behavior. My current working theory is that additional regions, particularly in the parietal cortex, may be recruited to represent working memory content specifically and sort of selectively when working memory is faced with additional demands. And the idea is that signals from those other regions can bridge disruptions and then reinstate the sensory cortical patterns when it comes time to retrieve or report the working memory content. So this idea is informed by other data from the Desposito lab. So for instance, here I'm showing the results from Elizabeth Lawrence's paper, and several other recent papers make a similar observation that working memory content information, it becomes detectable in parietal cortical signals only when working memory is faced with distraction. So here are the plots that are shown in yellow, but not when there is no distraction. So there seems to be a sort of flexible, context-dependent recruitment of different regions to represent the information. And that's suggestively corroborated in my data set, where the univariate signals from a similar region of parietal cortex and not other regions strongly correlate with working memory performance. So to summarize this middle section, working memory maintenance competes with other forms of attentional processing, but may recruit additional neural resources when necessary to overcome that competition. And I think this broader view of working memory that integrates across the brain and across different levels of analysis is going to be an important consideration to reconcile a number of ongoing debates about how and where working memory is stored.
Sorry, I have a question.
Sure.
So for the task that you're using to distract their attention, have you ever tried using a different modality task? Because I was wondering whether this interference only happens within the same modality, or is it as long as there is large attentional consumption, then there will be an interference?
Yeah, so I haven't used other modalities, but other people have. And your instinct is a good one. Basically, the interference is much greater within the same modality. And, you know, the study that I took out and didn't show here uses distracting information from the same sort of stimulus class. So in addition to sort of visual being more competitive visual, if you're distracting with other content from the same category, and sort of intuitively, that's much more interfering. But there are still dual task costs and a smaller but real effect of, you know, interference or competition, you know, between different modalities and domains that seem to tap into more of a sort of central attentional function. So essentially, I mean, there are several levels at which I think the competition manifests, and it's going to be the greatest when there's the most overlap in the representations and the processes and the functions involved, which is maybe sort of an obvious thing to say, but it is still there in other when using other modalities.
Cool, thank you.
All right, so you know, I think another important consideration for informing these debates is why we're maintaining the content in the first place. Namely, in many cases, working memory content ultimately serves to guide some goal-directed action. So this final section is focused on the idea that this action intention should also influence how working memory competes with ongoing behaviors. So we saw in the first part of the talk that our internally maintained content can sometimes inadvertently influence our attention in the environment. And, you know, if this arises from the adaptive role of working memory in guiding cognition, where it would typically be favorable to enhance processing of stimuli that match what's being held internally, because that information is typically goal relevant, then we should see a similar interplay between working memory and the execution of actions. Because, you know, at the end of the day, why are we keeping this stuff in mind? The ultimate objective is typically to support not just what we think, but what we do. But like in perception, this adaptive purpose might also sometimes produce flukes in behavior. So I think it could explain, for instance, why you might sometimes accidentally type out or speak the wrong word aloud in conversation when it was going through your mind. So in this is a multi-part study that was a collaboration with Rich Ivory, and some parts of it are still ongoing. We're going to test whether this kind of competition, or what's termed an action slip, stems from working memory maintenance and also how it can be controlled. And I'll just say that you know, most of these data were collected by the great grad student in the Desposito lab, Jacob Miller, and he also did most of these analyses. So to do this, we approximated a simple scenario where information was maintained for future use while performing immediate actions. Here, participants remembered a directional word, either left, right, up, or down. Then during the delay, they completed a motor task where a central colored square cued a mouse movement to one of 4 screen locations. And participants were trained beforehand to associate each of 4 colors with one location. For instance, green for left, blue for down, and so on. Then after another brief delay, they were tested on their memory of the initial word. And on individual trials, the meaning of the working memory sample could either be compatible or incompatible with the direction of the cued hand movement. So I'm going to focus on the comparison between these trial types in motor behavior as our measure of competition. So if motor performance is relatively impaired on incompatible trials, it would provide evidence that the maintained content is also influencing action execution. But if this influence arises from the adaptive role of working memory maintenance, these sorts of slips should be modulated or controlled by the relevance of the maintained content to current goals. So we also manipulated the proportion of compatible to incompatible trials across 3 block conditions. So in highly predictive blocks, the working memory content was most likely to be compatible with movement goals, and we might expect it in that case to exert a greater influence over behavior because it would be relatively prioritized. And that's compared to what we call an uninformative condition, where working memory and movement goals are equally likely to be compatible or incompatible. And in an anti-predictive context, where the working memory content is more likely to be incompatible, it should be relatively deprioritized, and we might expect it to exert less influence over behavior. So then the differences between these block conditions will serve as a measure of control over the competition between working memory and action goals. So first, I'll examine the course that hand movements took using cursor path data to test whether there's a basic competition effect. And then I'll look at whether it's influenced by the block predictability condition. We get all kinds of cool measures out of this movement data. But for instance, on a compatible trial, we might expect hand movements to quickly and directly reach their target, resulting in a movement path that looks something like this. Whereas on incompatible trials, you might expect participants to first sort of move in the direction that corresponds to what's being held in working memory, only to ultimately correct course and land at the proper target, resulting in a movement path that looks something like this. And of course, when we compare the cursor paths for compatible and incompatible trials, this is in fact what we see. These off-course cursor paths that need to be adjusted to reach the correct target are much more frequent on incompatible trials. So this effect indicates that the meaning of what's being held in working memory, it can actually shape the trajectory of hand movements. That is, we're not just now talking about sort of minute decrements in perceptual processing, but dramatic shifts in the course of our motor behavior. When we look at movement speeds, even accurate movements also take much longer on incompatible trials. But when we examine this effect as a function of the proportion of compatible to incompatible trials in the block, the effect is magnified in these predictive blocks when the working memory content's most likely to help behavior on the motor task. So here I'm just plotting this effect as a difference score to illustrate this point that the more highly relevant the working memory content, shown here in green, the stronger its influence over motor behavior. So therefore, we are able to strategically prioritize based on the task context and exert some control over this competition between our internal content and, in this case, our actions. All right, finally, we used TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, to causally test what neural circuitry supports this control. So just to briefly describe the general TMS approach, we use a neuronavigation system to guide stimulation to individual personalized brain targets of interest. And then we apply brief magnetic pulses on the scalp over the target area of cortex, which can result in either temporarily increased or decreased cortical excitability of the stimulated region, depending on a number of factors like the frequency and pattern of pulses that you apply. And this is produces a subtle effect, but it can be a very powerful approach because fMRI is inherently correlational. So TMS is really exciting, to use as a tool in combination with fMRI to causally test predictions about how observed activations functionally support behaviors. So for this study, based on a rich literature associating frontostriatal circuitry with the control of behavioral output of working memory, we selected a lateral frontal region based on its connectivity with the striatum, and then we stimulated that target. So if our our competition effect does in fact depend on this circuit, then it should be modulated by the stimulation. And we use both an excitatory and an inhibitory stimulation protocol on different days so that they can serve as active controls for each other, delivering the same total number of pulses at the same intensity to the exact same cortical target. And we use what's known as an offline TMS protocol, meaning that first stimulation was delivered to perturb neural activity, and then participants perform the tasks that I just described after stimulation was complete, but during the window of time when it should continue to have an effect. So I'm just going to give a very brief snapshot of these behavioral data, comparing movement accuracy as a function of the stimulation condition. So we also administered a no TMS control condition to confirm that the behavioral pattern replicated in this new cohort. And we see that they show a competition effect like the other cohort. When we plot this as a difference score, we see a small but highly significant competition effect. And in accuracy, and this was also the case in the other cohort, it varied little with the block condition. But after inhibitory TMS, the competition effect is eliminated selectively in the anti-predictive block condition. Whereas after excitatory TMS, the effect was magnified in the predictive block condition instead. So, one way to interpret this is that inhibitory TMS further inhibits the lowest priority working memory content and minimizes the competition between working memory and motor behavior. While the excitatory TMS further excites what's the highest priority working memory content and magnifies that competition instead. So excitatory and inhibitory TMS, they have dissociable impacts on behavior, giving us causal evidence that this frontostriatal circuit is involved in the control over the interplay between our internal content and our externally oriented actions. So to summarize this last section, we've seen that when maintained content conflicts with movement goals, it can actually change the course of our hand movements, but we can strategically modulate these action slips and minimize them when we know that working memory content's less likely to be helpful to our immediate task. And we think that this control biases the competition between working memory and motor representations in a goal-directed way through frontostriatal interactions. So this last study showed that we can adaptively control this interplay between our internally maintained content and our actions based on their relative task relevance. That is, we don't just start screaming out every thought that's running through our minds or wildly flailing our arms because we're thinking of some directional word, but it's the correspondence between the goals of our internal maintenance and concurrent demands that engenders the interaction. So just to sum up what I've told you, we've used behavioral probes to show patterns of behavior that are consistent with the idea that working memory maintenance competes with representations for perception and action and producing sometimes unexpected consequences for behavior. We've used fMRI measurements to show that neural activity associated with working memory reflects this competition. And we've used causal stimulation to selectively modulate cortical excitability and determine that frontostriatal circuits underlie this context-dependent interplay between our internal content and our actions. I was going to briefly talk about the ongoing studies that continue to use this kind of convergent approach. But I'm fearing that it might be dragging on a little bit here. So no, are you saying? I can take two more minutes to just very briefly not go into the data, but just describe these ongoing studies. It's so hard to do this virtually because I cannot read the room at all. But I'll just get these out here just because they're, kind of cool studies in their own right, and maybe some people will be interested in them. So I've continued to use this multimodal approach. Like I mentioned at the outset, there's still a lot of uncertainty in the field about the functional role of the neural signals that are associated with working memory. So in one very large scale attempt to address this issue, we're using TMS to several frontal and parietal regions that are routinely activated by working memory demands, and then testing several visual working memory task behaviors in conjunction with that TMS. Because even though these regions are known to be associated with working memory, for instance, the superior interparietal sulcus, it's unclear whether these different frontal parietal regions make unique contributions, and if so, what they actually are. So I just wanted to mention this study because it takes a pretty unique methodological approach, and that we submitted it as a registered report, meaning that the whole project was peer-reviewed before starting data collection, and reviewers gave input on the experimental design and the analysis plan. And now we have to adhere to that pre-registered plan. So rather than just fit a bunch of models after the fact, we had to hypothesize which specific parameters would be influenced by TMS and in precisely what way, so that we could clearly arbitrate between particular theories. And frankly, a ton of unexpected issues arise when you have to conduct a study like this, adhering to exact specifications that you laid out before data collection. So, we had built in a bunch of quality control and exclusion criteria to make the protocol as rigorous as possible. But we built in so many of those that it excludes more than 2/3 of our sample. So at this point, we've scanned 120 participants on these multiple working memory tasks, towards the ultimate goal of having 40 participants that have a complete data set with 5 days of testing, including fMRI and behavior and individual differences. So it's been a huge undertaking, but also means that we have this, pretty unprecedented set of visual working memory, behavioral, fMRI, and TMS data that hopefully many people can take advantage of in years to come. And I'm doing this with a postdoc in the Despacito lab, Jason Semeka. So I have a data plot up here, but I didn't really want to interpret it because we're still collecting data. But with a huge sample like this, or huge for a TMS study, that is, we're seeing very small differences between the regions, but we can have confidence that they're real. So stay tuned for the full results of that, hopefully relatively soon. And then one other kind of wild study with a unique approach to address some of these inconsistencies is to examine whether they may be due to things like task and stimulus training. So, many of the conflicting theories about the roles of frontal versus sensory regions in working memory stem from incompatible findings between human fMRI and monkey electrophysiology. So aside from the sort of obvious distinction between the species, another glaring difference is that monkeys undergo months of training and thousands of trials to be able to perform the tasks that make up the data. So along with Jacob Miller, the graduate student, and Ariel Tambini, who was a postdoc in the Despacito lab, she's now assistant professor at UC Irvine. We tried to capture some of those training effects in a longitudinal study on ourselves, where we trained over 4 months to learn several memory tasks and a set of complex fractal stimuli. And we scanned ourselves repeatedly over those 4 months, about 30 times a piece, while we also completed at-home behavioral training. We attempted to do that every day, but it kind of fell off towards the end, so that we could examine how visual memory processes and representations may evolve over training to hopefully reconcile some of the human and monkey findings. And we have some pretty promising results whereby the human prefrontal activation patterns do evolve over training in a way that makes them resemble more the animal literature. So again, I'm totally glossing over all of this, but you know, it's intriguing that these neural substrates for working memory do seem to change with training. So, in sum, you know, while we're all motivated by this same basic drive to achieve our goals from one moment to the next, but we suffer to varying degrees from the constant distractions and interferences that challenge that ability. You know, but I want to drive home the point that our working memory or goal retention ability, it's not just one thing. The processes and the representations, they may change depending on the particular combination of task demands. So if we want to actually be able to translate knowledge on this topic into meaningful applications, we need to consider what working memory is being used for, you know, towards what goal, what kind of information it's operating on, and also examine it in the context of the other processes it interacts with. And with that, I will thank my former and current labs, collaborators, funders, and of course, all of you. Thank you so much.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
Thanks so much. It was a really fascinating talk. I have a question about the third set of studies you talked about, and maybe the comparative studies you alluded to at the end get at the answer to this question. But some of the stuff you're talking about seemed reminiscent of population vectors and some of the classic monkey neurophysiology work where you can measure from premotor cortex neurons and see that the direction the monkey is thinking of moving the joystick in ultimately is reflected in that part of the brain, right? And what's interesting is when you teach that monkey that if you see the light up here, you need to move the joystick down. And if you look at the population vectors, they immediately reflect the predisposition to go up, and then that predisposition is inhibited and they ultimately move the joystick down, and then the neural response reflects that. So I'm just curious whether you think that you really need to appeal to working memory when you have those sorts of neurophysiological measurements that seem to immediately reflect the goal of the monkey. And it seems to do so in a part of the brain that is not the one that you stimulated with TMS. I mean, the data you presented was very compelling, but I'm just curious whether in that case, you need to ultimately appeal to working memory.
Well, yeah, and of course, I don't think that the region that we stimulated is the only, is more relevant than, you know, motor regions in a task like this. You know, we selected that region based specifically on its hypothesized role in sort of controlling the interplay between working memory and other behaviors, or in its role in what's called output gating. You know, when you have several items being held in working memory, there's this hypothesis that when you attend to one among several, it sort of transforms that attended representation into a unique behavior driving status that then can influence ongoing behavior, even so. And this is what we're trying to get at here. Even when you know, the more immediate goal of the motor task is distinct from the goal of the working memory behavior. So yeah, no, well, I guess I'm still not sure. You know, I totally agree that those, you know, population vector studies, you know, give us straightforward information about the goal of the animal, but that doesn't speak to what those representations look like when the goal faces competition that may, sort of activate the correct goal or may interfere with it. We're actually developing a related offshoot from this study using MEG to examine how, the kind of goal representation may evolve across the trial and leading up to the movement, from one that first represents the direction that's suggested by working memory, but then may, with control, then kind of evolve into the correct goal. I don't know. I feel like I'm missing some other point about what you said.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's helpful, especially when you consider that it's goal directed. I'm just wondering if an essential part of working memory actually requires like a delay period or some degree of maintenance, or are you altogether bypassing the need for working memory when the response is immediate?
Yeah, I guess the crux of what I'm getting at is, so I don't think you need working, well, it's not a foregone conclusion, but in my perspective, the need to maintain for some period of time, whatever that maintenance mechanism is sort of a precondition of working memory. But the crux of what I'm getting at, I guess, is what those when you have more than one goal sort of simultaneously active, how those are, one goal is I have to remember this thing for later, and then you have an incidental, more immediate goal. Those things can be more or less compatible or more or less in conflict, and how do you, arbitrate between them?
Thank you.
I have a question about the first study, and it's not a fair question. It's what do you think would happen question. So, so could you go back to the first slide of the first experiment? Is that going to be
Just showing the task itself?
Yeah, task. Yeah, because I might have completely misremembered it. So you have a remembered word, and that evokes somehow the actual color red, so that subsequently, after you have to make a decision, it affects your decision sometime later, a second later, 2 seconds later, whatever.
Yeah, it's a few seconds.
A few seconds later. Okay, so one of the things I know from the traditional stupefact is that, especially if you're making verbal responses, that it's hugely asymmetrical. So the word RED affects naming the color patch much more than the color patch affects the reading the word. Okay, if you separate them, you can separate them in time. You can have the patch, then the word, or the word, then the patch. You still get a stupefact, but the word just has a huge effect, and the color patch doesn't have much of an effect. So I'm wondering, part of your theory is that it has to do with the match between the frontal representation in working memory and subsequent feedback mechanism or storage mechanism to make contact with sensory cortex. So by that simple interpretation, you might expect I don't think this would work that way, but you might expect a larger effect if the remembered item was a color patch and the The identity item was a color patch because they're both the same representation. Just as if, I don't think that would happen. I think you would get, you designed it so you get the biggest effect. But just when you were talking about, I think to Cindy's question, if you would get a cross-modal effect, and you said yes, but it probably wouldn't be as big as if they were in the same modality. The more similar the frontal and the sensory representations were, the bigger the effect. I think this might be an interesting exception if, in fact, the word read somehow, as something to remember, has a bigger effect than an actual red patch. That's a speculation. I don't know if that's would be
Well,
true.
I'll say, I don't actually, so you introduced this as like the idea that reading the word red would activate the color red. And I think it does to some extent, but I'm not actually claiming that that's what's going on here, because I think in both the Stroop and in this version of the Stroop, the effect might come from the other direction, where seeing the color red activates the word red, and so then the interference might be at that level of the verbal processing. I did have some follow-up additional experiments here that showed that there were both contributions from the stimulus itself and the response associated with the stimulus. So basically did a number of manipulations that are similar to the kinds of manipulations that have been done with the regular Stroop, and the patterns tend to pretty much hold across those. So I mean, that was really the idea here, to show that this sort of well-established thing that we see in an attentional task happens in working memory too. But with this kind of study, we can't really say, well, maybe we can. I didn't really say at what level or exactly where that competition is occurring. So even though I refer to the idea of this sensory cortical overlap, it could be at the cortical, the overlap for the reading, the reading or rehearsal aspect, and not necessarily in the color representation itself. But are you thinking if we just flip it? I think
It might be something that, I don't know how I would model it, but I just have this intuition that, if you swapped it around, even like had a red patch and then the word red, and then you have to say yes or no, same or different, might be less of an effect than this way. And somehow, I mean, there's a connection there, but I'm not exactly sure how the connection is. I mean, it's a beautiful connection. And if you were to do, well, you can't get, if you were to, you have in MRI, you have, you have the presentation time, you have the maintenance time, and you have the exposure time, and you could see, where, is it V4 or is it some prefrontal area that's, how those things, how that is put together. I don't know. I just like it bopped up in my brain when you were talking about the Stroop effect, and I said, oh, well, that's exactly how I would design a Stroop effect task. I'd have the word, but there's not really a great theory of how that works. I wrote a paper on why it's asymmetrical with Archie Momura, and I don't believe a word of it. It hasn't been totally made clear to me, but
well, I thought the party line was just something about the predominance of the verbal processing, because a Stroop effect like this does vary or is modulated with, with verbal fluency.
Yeah, but there's a lot of reasons which I cannot remember because it's been 30 years since I did that paper. It was right when I started Berkeley. That bombs. That you automatically rewords that theory bombs. But I'll have to look it up and send you the good reference on that, which I think is by Howard Hegath about 1 million years ago. But I just throw in maybe you can move those around a little bit if you have time. It's not the most important thing, but well, actually, you might be able to shed light on where the anterior and posterior, flow happens. Like what is the circuit, or what happens first and then what happens second.
Yeah, no, I think it would be worthwhile because, I thought of this as just such a simple, it was sort of a fun
It's a beautiful
project, and I thought it was kind of obvious, but it's the one that I get the most questions about all the time. People are pretty intrigued. I mean, and it's, a few people have replicated it and maybe have done some of those manipulations that you're describing, but I can't remember off the top of my head what they found, which is bad.
May I ask a really naive question that I was concerned in the way the issue that Bill was talking about? What about looking at, I can't imagine rehearsing the color red. I imagine saying to myself red. And I wonder, what would you find if you look, say, in superior temporal at auditory cueing for things like shared the word red and the word yellow and the word orange? Because it seems to me that when I try to imagine doing working memory on most things, I have to, as you said, say it to yourself over and over. It's the rehearsal, and the rehearsal is it always seems like to me very auditory. I don't know. Or is it speech, maybe?
Yeah, no, I mean, and this is a big issue that plagues so much of visual working memory research, because even when the stimuli are entirely visual, and there are many controls that you can try to put into place to, prevent rehearsal and promote a more visual maintenance strategy. But even in that case, it does seem to be that most people find a way to turn things into a verbal rehearsal strategy, whenever it's possible. So yeah, and the part of that, MEG study. So this is obviously has some similarities to that last study that I described with the movement interference, and part of what we're examining with the follow-up studies is sort of how much the detectability of information about the working memory content then predicts or relates to the extent of the interference. So I guess I would predict that, yeah, sort of the more decodable the color is from verbal rehearsal or verbal representation regions, that might predict the extent of the interference with the, I call it a perceptual task because you have to perceive the color to make a report, but it's, you also.
So just to be a contrarian to my friend Irv Hafter, is we have another faculty, Eleanor Rosh, who actually did a short-term memory task. All of her tasks with Danny were short-term memory tasks, where she showed a chip, and then 10 seconds later, they had to look at on a blanket for which all these chips were laid around. And it didn't matter whether they had the particular focal word in their language or not. At least that other people have spent careers to try and show you that she's wrong. But anyways, that's
Well, but that's why it's so complicated. And it's not just, there is some place where the working memory representation is stored, and therefore you see interference at, at one particular level of representation. There, I don't know if to call them redundancies, but the information is stored at several different levels. So you're going to have both the word read and the color read being activated simultaneously. And I think that that's for the most part adaptive, because then you have sort of, several representations to help you, and one is interfered with, but it makes it really hard to, zero in on exactly all, how and where all this is going down.
Peace serve.
I have a related question to this paradigm. So I was kind of just wondering how how do you make sure this is actually influenced by working memory? Because we have also some similar tasks called just priming task, because you just basically, so I'm trying to throw myself into this task. You're shown a word, you're asked to remember it, and then you're shown like a color patch. So this is kind of similar to like the task structure of a priming test, which is you just show a word, but you don't have to memorize it. But later on, we will still see it has an effect on like whatever going on later on. So does working memory, or the other way to say it is, does memorizing it actually is required to affect the perceptual representation later on? So that's my question, I guess.
Yeah, well, we have a priming control in this study, and another group has done the same thing and have also incorporated a priming control. We found actually a very small effect when it was just priming. I'm trying to remember exactly what I did. I think we just showed the word and then you did the color task. So same timing and same, perceptual input all around, but no task to actually report on the memory content. And we saw some effective priming, but much smaller. I think it was like, 10 or 20 milliseconds or something, whereas this is about 100. And then another group that replicated this, I think, found either the same thing or no effective priming. But so basically, I think the priming will promote a similar effect. My stance being that you have some, whatever neural response pattern you have when you read the word read, there's going to be some residual activation. Either you maintain that residual activation because you need to, because you're going to be tested, or it decays over a certain period of time. And so you will have some impact of priming, but when you maintain it actively for working memory task, it's much stronger.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I would like to make one more comment. I thought it was a wonderful talk. I enjoyed it, but it's been the whole season. I would like especially to thank Christina for making all this work so well for all of us. I think she's really been fantastic. And thank you certainly for including me.
Indeed, yeah. Thanks to Anastasia for a great talk, very clear, excellent work. And also, yes, thanks to Christina, as always. Life would come to a stop if it weren't for Christina. So wherever you are you there? Yes, there you are. Okay, thank you, Christina.
Oh, that is very sweet.
And thanks again to Anastasia for being our final speaker. Hey, Bill, you want to lead us?
For last.
Okay, we have this thing about trying to have a simultaneous class, which works when we're in the same room, but it always That's the second delay when we do it online. So we'll try as hard as we can. Everybody ready?
Okay.
1,
Am I clapping?
3. That was bad.
It was perfect. It was perfect.
We have to
Absolutely perfect.
practice.
Bye-bye, everybody.